Hey, if you're checking out my video, I appreciate it. This is sample sizing stats for projections. This is for fantasy football. A lot of people that play fantasy football, they already know how to do, something like this. But if you're unfamiliar with it, we're just going to kind of dive into it real quick, and I'll kind of show you how it works. So you want to find a small sample size and expand it to the amount of games that were played. And I use a couple of examples. So what you'll do is find the total amount of yards, and, I use touchdowns as well. You'll divide that by the total of games that were played, and then you'll multiply that by the rest of the season total of games, which were, they played, 17 games? So, and I kind of done this last year with a player. Now, I kind of jumped the gun a little bit. It was only 2 games into the season, but it was for Jalen Hurts. And in weeks 1 and 2, you can see he had, week 1, 32 passing attempts, 243 yards, no touchdowns, no interceptions, and rushing. He rushed it for 17 yards, 90 rushing yards, and 1 rushing touchdown. Okay, in week 2, 31, 333, he had a touchdown and an interception. And then he rushed the ball for 11, 57, 2 touchdowns. Now, this more than likely isn't going to keep up, but you have an idea that, you already knew Jalen Hurts was going to rush the ball. But this kind of gave you an indication that he's going to do it very frequent. Now, it's not going to be this frequent, but we're just going to use this as an example. And in my league, personally, the guy that just got Patrick Mahomes was available in the draft. He got him. He didn't want to get rid of him. Josh Allen, the guy that had Josh Allen, he was stacked with Stefon Diggs. So I thought Jalen Hurts was the next best thing, especially with the rushing, and you can see he was going to do it a lot, and I trusted him. So what you do, it shows the passing attempts. He had 32 and 31. So you'll just add those together. You get a total of 63, divide that by the number of games that were played, which were only 2 in this instance. You get 31 and a half, times that by 17, gives you 535 and a half. As you can see, you can pause this if you want, but I go through the whole thing: passing yards, passing touchdowns, interceptions, rushing attempts, rushing yards, and rushing touchdowns. Now, it gives you a pretty bizarre outlook right here: 25.5 rushing touchdowns, which a quarterback more than likely isn't going to do that. But as you can see, passing touchdowns were down and interceptions, they were up. So sometimes it's too small of a sample size. Right here. So total stats for the year. As you can compare, so the sample size showed us that he had, 1,100 more passing yards, a lot less passing touchdowns, basically 2 more interceptions, a lot more rushing attempts, not quite twice as much rushing yards, but a quarterback more than likely isn't going to get 1,249 rushing yards. Not saying it can't happen, but the probability is just really low, plus 25 rushing touchdowns as well. But as you can see, when it all factors out, total fantasy points per game, 24.4 to 25.2. Now, basically, this is too small of a sample size. That's why some of the numbers, like the 25 rushing yards, 1,200 rushing yards for a quarterback, that's why it's a little bizarre. But the passing touchdowns are down, and as you can see, it kind of works out just trying to get a total of fantasy points per game is basically what you're looking for. Another example, we got Christian McCaffrey whenever he was with the Panthers. We got rushing attempts, rushing yards, touchdowns, targets, receptions, rushing yards, rushing and reception touchdowns. Comes out to fantasy points per game, which was 16.9. But if you look over, and this is half PPR, which is mainly what we play, and I prefer it. And as you can see, he was like 2.5 fantasy points per game better with the 49ers. And so the left side of the stats with the Panthers, that's just the totals he had with them. and the right side is the 11 games he had with the 49ers. A lot of times, I throw in the rushing attempts and targets. You mostly want to look at volume. That's really what you want to go off. You can use this for receptions and rushing yards, reception yards as well. The touchdowns is very hard to predict. It's, kind of like Jamal Williams last year. I mean, he outscored, what do you have, 20 touchdowns, and it's just hard to predict. But you can kind of throw it out there. So we take that same sample size, what he had with the 49ers, it's the same thing as the last slide, and we take this method and we apply it. So it gives us, if we look at next year, Christian McCaffrey, 245 rushing attempts, 1,100 yards, around 9 touchdowns, 100 targets, which he's done twice already. Get about 80 receptions out of that, 717 yards, and 6 reception touchdowns. That gives you 14.5, which is a lot lower. But like I said, touchdowns are hard to predict. He could have more, he could have less. And even last year, he threw a touchdown pass, which isn't even in this. So that's what kind of really boosts fantasy points per game. But this gives you a baseline at about 15 points per game. And if you just throw that in as a total for half PPR, it was good for 6th best. And if you do this for every player in that range, it's going to come out, kind of even. But you do the same thing. That's why I added it down at the bottom. You divide each by 11 games, multiplied by total number of games, which is 17, add the totals, and average the points. So it's basically just a rough estimate to get totals for, but it can provide you with a baseline for the players you're interested in. I plan on doing this with a lot more fantasy players. I've got more to come. The thing is, Christian McCaffrey, he's a consensus, number 1 pick most of the time, or he's at least going to go in the top 5. So you want to do this with players that are going in the mid to later rounds that maybe you can either avoid or you have more interest in. Some of these you might work out totals, and you might think to yourself, well, I don't want to draft him. He wasn't as good as I thought, or the vice versa. He's a little bit better than I expected, giving you a certain points per game. Kind of like Tyler Lockett. He's a guy, it kind of seems like he's a boomer bust type player, goes later in the later mid rounds, but he can win you about a fantasy game on any given week. But we'll get into more of those. But this is my first fantasy video, and if you checked it out, I greatly appreciate it. I plan on doing a lot more, and I'm really going to try to do a deep dive into this stuff. So I appreciate you checking it out. If there's anything else you would like to ask, post in the comments, and I'll try to answer that as well and make a video about it. Thanks.